today. And so I'm really happy to announce our next speaker, who's Rhiannon Dewar. Rhiannon Dawn Dewar is an artist who focuses primarily on cutifying horror and horrifying cutes, driven by her maladaptive daydreaming syndrome. In the following presentation, Rhiannon plans to very briefly discuss how horror, despite being inherently for the outsider, has been forcefully guided into the acceptable face of Western society, and how this has done a beautiful and ancient genre a great disservice in the modern world, specifically focusing on the idea of the target audience versus the achieved audience. And somebody's knocking on my door, such as the perils of working from home. So using extracts from Rhiannon's upcoming book, The Virgin Always Lives, the title of Rhiannon's paper today is Sexuality in Contemporary Western Horror Films. Welcome, Rhiannon.
Hello. Quick trigger warning. I will very briefly be mentioning things along the lines of sexual assault as well as violence and murder, which kind of go hand in hand with horror. So if anyone wants to duck out for the next 10 minutes, I won't be offended. Go ahead. As Helen just said, my name is Rhiannon Dawn Dewar, and in 2020 I won the Alan Woods Memoriam Prize for my dissertation, The Virgin Always Lives, which I'm currently expanding into a book to be put online for purchase, hopefully May this year, provided the world doesn't end. Please see the link at the end for more information. The following is an excerpt from Chapter 1 regarding the issue of marketing in horror. Pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly. Mulvey, 1975. A literal example of this would be John Carpenter's Halloween, 1978, where we begin by witnessing a young Michael Myers stabbing his semi-nude sister through the eye holes of his Halloween mask for the crime of having premarital sex. We learn to identify with Killer Michael's sexual frustration within the first 5 minutes of the film, making it easier for us and the 1970s audience, who were presumed to be cis-het white males, to identify with the presumed scopophilia and obsession with the sister figure / virgin figure, simultaneously denying us the chance to be simultaneously denying us the chance to identify with the terrified naked teenage girl being slaughtered in her own bedroom. Western horror has been so saturated with the male gaze that even when a film is created by women for women, its success is still determined by the male audience. Next slide, please, if you don't mind. For my example today, I will be using the 2009 flop-turned-cult classic Jennifer's Body, directed by Karen Kusama and written by Diablo Cody. A new interpretation of the rape revenge narrative, we see an indie boy band desperate for fame, a mysterious deadly fire, and a white male appropriation of witchcraft as seen through the lens of an Americanized Christian society. A teenage girl called Jennifer is kidnapped, tied up, taunted, and brutalized before her inevitable heartbreaking murder. However, Jennifer not being a virgin as the grown men had assumed about her, she returns. Possessed by a succubus, Jennifer seduces and devours the boys from her school and destroys her semi-romantic relationship with protagonist Needy. Jennifer is portrayed as dead behind the eyes and mimicking the teasing nature of her own assailants to cope with the trauma, something which unfortunately too many young women are familiar with. When writer and creator Diablo Cody was given the chance to write the feminist horror flick, she soon discovered that the film would be kamikazed by the studio executives and marketing team. Despite the film's critical and satirical themes tackling the horror of patriarchal standards corrupting young women and their closest friendships, the studio had decided that the best way to monetize from this was to capitalize on the sex appeal of a 23-year-old Megan Fox. After Kusama and Cody requested an explanation for the quite frankly appalling marketing scheme which suggested forcing the young and rising star Fox to play hostess to an amateur porn site which is unnamed, but I think we all know which one, Kusama and Cody promptly received a very short email reply simply stating, "Jennifer's sexy, she's still your boyfriend," a reply which Cody would later describe as if a caveman had written it. When Cody and Fox met for the 10th anniversary reunion interview, they discussed disparagingly the level of hypersexualized objectification Fox was suffering at the time in retaliation to her speaking out against critically acclaimed director Michael Bay for his misconduct towards her on set starting at age 15. And how the film's believe young women attitude negatively affected its reception. Even during test screenings, the initially intended audience of young women and teenage girls was negated in favour of, to quote Cody 2019, the coveted, precious, white male 18 to 24-year-old demographic. I don't recall seeing many girls there at all. Cody recounted a test card from one such young man who, in response to the question of what could be improved about the film, simply wrote, needs more boobs, and boobs was spelled B-E-W-B-S. And this was the data that was collected and taken seriously by the people who were marketing my movie. So it's not surprising that the film in its initial office release failed by Hollywood standards, earning only roughly $31 million worldwide. $31 million worldwide with a $16 million budget. A film about the negative effects of patriarchy on teenage girls being marketed solely towards young heterosexual cis men as a blood and breast punchy punk rock soundtrack was always going to leave the audience confused and dismayed at best. The male audience has entered this world expecting the usual male active, female passive roles, as they most likely have always seen themselves, aligning with Mulvey's theory of the male gaze. To be thrown unexpectedly into a reality where not only are the roles reversed, but the leading woman uses and actively encourages other women to use this presumed social structure against the gazing male certainly would be jarring for the heterosexual cisgender boy. And the reviews smothered any further hope of the film sparking the flame of serious conversation. Still, on the 10th anniversary, it has only claimed a 44% on Rotten Tomatoes critic review section, whilst at-home reviewers gave it a sucker-punching 34%. Even some of the usually classier film reviews missed the point entirely, with an abysmal 3-star rating from acclaimed critic Roger Ebert utterly losing interest within halfway through the film, comparing it to Twilight for boys, except I recall Patterson was shirtless. Although compared to the less dashing reviews, which featured complaints of being offered nary a glimpse of Miss Fox's naked glories, Ebert's assessment was downright heartwarming. This would prove to be a running theme, the adult men reviewing the film seeming unnervingly obsessed with the lack of nude high school girls on a platter. Jennifer's body is not funny, nor is it sexy. All the girls keep their clothes on. Megan Fox even has a no nudity clause in her contract. And those were just the professionals. I dread to even read aloud what the at-home viewer wrote. It is not surprising this was the case, however. White male identifying critics wrote 63.9% of film reviews in 2017, according to the USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative's 2018 study, Gender and Race in Film Reviews. An argument that has been made in defense of the film's marketing was that the marketing team predicted the majority of influential film critics would have a similar opinion based on this aversion of the male gaze, and were trying to make up for the lack of sex in the movie by using advertisements to draw more attention to the few and far between sexy sequences. Male audiences, thinking of these scenes, presumably, which had already permeated their sexual psyche before they enter the world of Devil's Kettle USA, may have been swayed to judge the film more positively. A flimsy defence at best, and even if it is true, clearly it didn't work. The team made it a very difficult job to both subvert the male gaze in such a violent way and receive critical acclaim the film deserved. Whilst the film did have many points which could have been accurately criticised, such as its all-white cast, the film centred itself on whether or not there was enough gay content. Unfortunately, those criticising the lack of gay content were not queer women themselves, but straight men who had been promising the advertising a lesbian sex scene, which they never received. With Jennifer's Body, Cody took an active attempt to subvert ideas about what a monstrous woman is, what a rape revenge narrative could be, and how young women cope in a world where they are always expected to inhabit the passive gaze. Even if it failed by mainstream standards, these aspects have made it a cult classic 10 years on. Cinematic narrative could be changing now again, just as Mulvey suggested it was when she wrote seminal work Visual Pleasure in 1975. The alternative cinema provides a space for cinema to be born in which is radical in both political and aesthetic sense and challenges the basic assumptions of mainstream film. Visual pleasure in narrative cinema discusses the notion of the cinematic gaze, or the male gaze. However, it is important to note that this piece does not take into consideration the full gender spectrum and operates using the gender binary of male equaling man and female equaling woman. There is also very little discussion of how race plays into this dynamic. Cisgender men are encouraged to see their gaze as the default, and this is then used to fetishize cisgender women and villainize transgender women on screen. This falls under Mulvey's discussion of scopophilia in cinema from Freud's 3 essays on sexuality. At this point, he associated scopophilia with with taking other people as objects, subjecting them to controlling and curious gaze. Mulvey, 1975. Mulvey further suggests that cinema has 3 stages of the gaze: that of the camera as it records the pro-filmic events, that of the audience as it watches the final product, and that of the characters at each other within the screen's illusion. Mulvey, 1975. In relation to women in the horror movie, Mulvey discusses the concept of women's guilt in cinema narratives, using an example of Alfred Hitchcock's 1954 thriller Rear Window, in which leading male, James Stewart, playing Jeff, sees himself as trapped and in his view has no choice but to gaze upon his neighbours and stare into their apartments all day long, absolving himself of any voyeuristic guilt. When his love interest Lisa, played by Grace Kelly, decides to engage in his obsessive viewing by breaking into the assumed villain's apartment, he is then permitted not only to gaze upon her from the perspective of the audience, but he is able to see her as guiltier than he, and therefore in need of rescuing and punishment, allowing the male lead / viewer to enact dominance over the female sidekick and fulfill established cultural norms. True perversion is barely concealed under a shallow mask of ideological correctness. The man on the right side of the law, the woman on the wrong. Mulvey, 1975. This suggests that the male gaze is not only used to satisfy the viewer, satisfy the viewer's sexual desires, but to then place blame for this emotion onto the sexual object. Otherwise, it would indicate a shift in power dynamics, granting the woman control and the woman being the representative of castration, a lesser version of the man. This would then make something truly to be feared. If she holds guilt, however, it allows the male viewer to be judged, keeping her in a state of punishable vulnerability like a child or a wife. For a more modern example, the common trope of a woman's breasts in a horror film being used to signal her imminent demise, as discussed in Wes Craven's Scream and Joss Whedon's Cabin in the Woods. However, this does not occur until she transcends into sin and the male viewer is sexually satisfied. This then immediately leads to her pornographic death. She even usually lands in a sexualized pose as a corpse. Pleasure lies in the assertion of guilt, asserting control and subjecting the guilty person through punishment or forgiveness. Mulvey, 1975. The final girl, when seen through the male gaze theory, is permitted to live only because she submits to patriarchal standards. She is a good girl, effortlessly sexy, but not sexual. She is not a threat in comparison to her bad girl ex-co-star who is now lying dead at her feet. So how does the concept of women's guilt play into the horror film, and how does guilt specifically tie itself into gender and the idea of the lone survivor? Well, that will be continued in my book. Next slide, please. Thanks for listening.
Thanks a lot, Rhiannon. Does anybody have any questions that they want to say into the comment section or put their hand up and say over the mic? Nope, nobody have anything they want to say. Well, that was...
There's a comment, Shanoa, just in the chat there. Are you able to read that out, or do you want me to?
My comment section's not open.
Oh, isn't it? Yeah, I apologise before, Rhiannon. It was my fault that the screen was flickering. There was something happening there. So it's from Dira Chakraborty, and it says, Rhiannon, your discussion on the films reminded me of the many arguments I had on the all-female Ghostbusters. While I definitely enjoyed the trophy male secretary and reconfiguring of the man as beauty without brains, there were quite a few acquaintances who laughed through the movie but ended up with comments like, yeah, it was okay. Definitely, my screen's going crazy. Yeah, if anybody else can finish that off for me. Definitely much underscored and mediocre than the original one. Thank you. That was a fantastic talk, Rhiannon, as well. And can you remind us about where your book's going to be available and where you're having it published?
So I am planning to self-publish at the moment. What I'm planning to do is there's a lot of websites where you can just have one book printed at a time, so as not to waste paper at, you know, this point in time, or people can pay me a little less and then they will just get it as a PDF download. When it's available, this will be available through all my social medias, which can be found on the link tree that is on the screen. Yeah, so hope you like it.
Fantastic. Let's have a talk about publishing as well, because we can maybe have a little chat about that after the conference at some point.